Fantastic. So, so my name is Alicia and I'll be talking about beavers in general. So we'll be looking at the ecology of beavers overall, looking at beavers in Britain, and then we'll talk a bit about the future, and this was where I'll hand over to Matt. And so first of all, in terms of the Welsh Beaver Project. Sorry, my slide's been a bit slow progressing. Sorry, yeah. So in terms of the Welsh Beaver Project, as the name suggests, it's a Wales-wide project led on behalf of the 5 trusts within Wales. It's led by Wildlife Trust Wales on behalf of the 5 trusts within Wales. So I've been working with the Wildlife Trust now for about 5 years, and our main aim with the Welsh Beaver Project is looking at the reintroduction of beavers into the wild. And prior to this, I worked with beavers in Scotland and an enclosed beaver project. So I've been working with beavers for about 10 years now in total. So first of all, in terms of beavers, so what are beavers? Well, they're rodents. In fact, they're the largest rodent we have in the Northern Hemisphere, and we only have 2 species of beaver in the world. We have the North American beaver, and as the name suggests, their distribution goes from Canada throughout most of the United States to northern Mexico, and then we have the Eurasian beaver, and I'll talk a bit about the Eurasian beaver's distribution in the next few slides. Both beavers species are social monogamous creatures, so unlike other rodents, beavers live within family groups consisting of the dominant male and female, and in their family group that can be up to 2 or 3 generations of kits. So you can have anything from 2 individuals in a beaver group up to 4 or 6 or even 8 animals, sometimes more than that if it's a large beaver family. They're also very slow beavers, so breeders, so unlike other rodents, they only have 1 litter per year, consisting of about 2 to 4 young within the litter, and the young are known as kits. And the young will stay with them till they're about two years old, and at that age, that's when they reach sexual maturity, and they're looking to then go and disperse and find a mate to set up their own family group. In some situations, though, the young may decide to stay with their family group and not disperse and become a non-breeding individual. And they tend to do this in areas where there's sort of low beaver numbers, low populations. And for the youngster, it's far better in terms of passing on your genes, of staying with your family group and helping your parents to raise the next generation of young, rather than risking trying to find a mate and then potentially not finding one and being able to set up your own family. So in some situations that does happen as well. And in that situation, well, in a beaver family, it's only ever the dominant male and female that will breed, so you don't have risk of interbreeding happening within a beaver family. They're also quite long-lived creatures, and they can live up to 10+ years. They're also very territorial animals, so although they're very happy within their family group, they don't tolerate their neighbours too much or very well. So if you've got a neighbouring beaver family sort of encroaching on their territory, this can lead to fights between different territories. So beavers will scent mark around their patch, around the territory, so on earth stumps or wooden tree stumps, beavers will scent mark, and this is just to mark out their territory and ward off their neighbours, so just tell them to keep away. They're semi-aquatic and very well adapted at being semi-aquatic, with webbed hind feet, paddle-shaped tail. Their eyes, ears, nose are all on top of their head, so when they first emerge into the water, they can keep a good look around, listen out, and just keep an eye out to make sure there's no danger before they head on their way to then go and feed. And being semi-aquatic is mainly a predator avoidance strategy for beavers. They're also entirely herbivorous, so vegetation is their diet. They have a wide dietary range. So in the summer months, it's soft vegetation like grasses, herbs, aquatic plants make up a majority of the diet. Then in the autumn time, they'll switch to a wooded diet. So this is when deciduous trees make up their diet during this time. So it's the bark of the trees that they're really after, which is why beavers fell the trees in order to get to all that bark. They're not very good climbers, so by felling the tree they can get to as much bark as possible. They'll also eat the leaves off the trees as well, and they'll also create food caches in the autumn months to keep them going then over the winter. So if they're unable to get on land over the winter, if the water body freezes up, they still have a food supply to keep them going. They're also very dexterous, and so this is just some footage of a beaver from a beaver enclosure in mid Wales, and just a good example of them using their hands to pick up their food. So small twigs and stuff, they just use their hands and almost eat it like corn on the cob as they roll it to strip the bark off those twigs. Beavers are also crepuscular, which means they're active dawn and dusk, and again this is just another predator avoidance strategy. And they're also engineers, and often referred to as ecosystem engineers. They're really good at constructions, and the main things they build are lodges and burrows. So these are basically areas to reside in or breeding. So the two pictures on the end are images of beaver lodges, which can come in various shapes and sizes, but usually it's a sort of burrow into a bank and then topped with lots of mud and sticks, and that will form a beaver lodge. So it'll have a main chamber inside with lots of entrances leading to those chambers, sleeping chambers and feeding chambers. They're also well known for building dams. The middle picture is a example of a beaver dam, and they mainly do this to control water levels. So beavers like deep water, and they need water at least 1 metre deep. So if they move into an area where it's very shallow water, so a very small stream, then they may need to raise the water level to make sure they have enough for them. And it's mainly to ensure that the entrance of their lodge and burrows is always underwater, and to also to get to more feeding resources as well. If they rarely go more than 20 metres away from the water's edge, so they may create a dam to raise the water level just to get that a little bit closer to some food. And it's only really small streams and tributaries that beavers will dam. They won't bother damming major rivers because they're just too deep for them and too fast flowing for a dam to stay in place. So just small streams and tributaries. So in terms of the distribution, historic distribution of the Eurasian beaver, this is shown on the map in red. So beavers, Eurasian beaver is native to Britain and was found right across majority of Europe, going into Asia, Mongolia and China mainly. The blue shading are areas where beavers never made it to, so there's no records of beavers ever being found in Ireland, and they're rarely found in southern Europe. So in terms of historic population, it was thought or estimated that the historic population is around 100 million individuals right across Europe. So very wide ranging and very numerous. And we know beavers are native to Britain because the amount of evidence that has been compiled and found. A lot of it can be found in this book, Beavers in Britain's Past, written by Bryony Coles. Now, Bryony Coles is a professor, or was a professor of archaeology at Exeter University, and she's done a lot of work around Britain and in parts of Europe as well. And through her work, she's found lots of evidence from ancient beaver North sticks, skeleton remains being found at various sites in Somerset and parts of Wales and other areas in Britain as well. Written records have been found. The very first written record in Wales dates back to 940 AD. There's evidence from place names as well around Britain. So, for example, you have Beverley in Yorkshire. There's places called Beaver Coats, Beaver Brooks in various places. And there's also folklore as well. So the Welsh word for beaver is a vanc, and this pops up in folklore as well. So all these things together sort of paint a picture of the distribution of beavers in Britain, so very wide ranging. However, by the late 19th century, it wasn't looking so good for the beaver, and pretty much went extinct through most of Europe. It was thought that beaver were extinct by the 16th century in Britain, and then by the late 19th century, the red dots on the map are where beavers was the only places you could find beavers. So the 4 red dots are the relic populations of beaver within Europe. And the main reason beavers went extinct was mainly through hunting, so unsustainable hunting. They were very valuable animal and well sought after for their pelts. The pelt is really soft and really dense fur, so ideal for making hats and coats, particularly in Northern Europe where you have very cold winters. They're hunted for their meat. In 16th century Europe, the Catholic Church considered beavers to be a fish, partly probably because they're semi-aquatic and their tail, which can look quite scaly. And so for that reason, beavers could be eaten on abstinence days. So that didn't really help the beaver's plight either. Teeth and claws used for jewelry. And the castoreum gland, which contains an oil, castoreum oil, was used for medicinal properties. So all these things together didn't help the beaver's plight. And as I mentioned, were just hunted unsustainably. However, over the years and in recent years, lots of research has demonstrated that actually beavers are a really valuable animal, not just in themselves, but in what they do. So through beaver activities of foraging, creating burrows, creating dams, which can help create areas of ponded water, all these different things create a mosaic of different habitats, and this can be really beneficial for a wide range of wildlife. So anything from plants, aquatic terrestrial plants, invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and all other mammals can all benefit from these different beaver activities. So this again, just demonstration of the research. So the research is wide ranging from North America and across mainland Europe, and more recently in Scotland and England as well. Some of the research has come from an enclosed site in Devon. It's a site that's been managed by Devon Wildlife Trust and they've been working with a number of experts, including Exeter University, looking at sort of to research what's been happening at this beaver site, from the changes in the habitat, including the changes in water. And so there's lots of knock-on benefits, not just for the wildlife, but for humans as well, in terms of what beavers can do. So looking closely at the site in Devon, so they decided, Devon Wildlife Trust decided to create a three hectare enclosure for beavers, which had a very small stream to start with. It's a woodland, grassland area, and the idea was to bring beavers in to manage the habitat. The stream was quite shallow, and because it was quite shallow, when the beavers were brought in, there just wasn't enough water for them. So over a 5-year period, a beaver family set to work, and over that time, they've created 13 dams. So on this slide, the black lines are those dams within that once very small streams. There's small streams here, and then as you can see, the black lines are those dams. And so going from a very small stream to sort of an extensive wetland area, so the grey shading behind the dams is where the water's collected behind those dams, created in some pools, and then the water spread out from there as well. And so Exeter University have been monitoring sort of the water flow through this site, and what they found over a 5-year period, over different weather events, they found the water of the area increased, so the beaver dams were able to store lots of water, so the volume and surface area of the water increased, and it also helped slow the flow of water through the site as well, particularly in heavy rainfall. So when there was lots of rain, they found that the amount of water flowing in through the site, so the blue arrow on this graph, was a lot higher than the amount of water leaving the site, so the red arrow on this graph. So basically the beaver ponds were holding back the water, and that was, beaver dams are made of mud and sticks, so they will let water through eventually, and by doing that it just means that the water slowly trickles through rather than just rushing through a very end-sized stream, which is what it once was. So potentially this is helping slow the flow and potentially helping to reduce the risk of flooding further downstream. They also found at the opposite end of the spectrum, in the summer months when it was a lot drier, and in some areas where months when it was almost drought conditions, other streams were drying up, but they found in this site, because of the water being held back by the beaver ponds, the beaver dams, that there was still water in the system. The dams were still allowing the water to flow through very slowly, and so even though there's very little water flowing into the site, or no water at all, there was still water flowing out of the site. So this is will be very beneficial for other species, other wildlife living further downstream. There's still water within this system. They also looked at the water quality of this site. So this site is surrounded by a number of fields which are prone to runoff from the fields into this beaver site. So they wanted to monitor the effects of what was happening within this site. And so what they found, they monitored above and below the dams. And what they found is by having the beaver dams there, that was actually helping to filter out the sediment and also the nutrients that are running off into the site. So they found above the dams, the sediment, and in this case, the phosphate and nitrogen, were a lot higher than below the dam. So the dams are holding back the sediment, and that was then holding back the nutrients. So essentially just filtering out those nutrients. So below the dams, the water quality was a lot better than above the dams. The only difference was, in this case, was the dissolved organic carbon was a lot higher below the dams than above the dams. And that's because beavers are in the system bringing back wooded material to the water through feeding and through creating the dams, so you get the natural decay of that. But what they have found is that beaver dams and beaver ponds can help store the carbon as well. So there's a carbon capture going on with this as well. And this Research has been looked at in other areas as well, Exeter University looking at other beaver sites to compare the results, and other sites have been looking at carbon storage of beaver activity in beaver dams as well. In terms of other wildlife, the benefits are wide-ranging. So research from across the board have looked at a number of different species, and our next few slides will just give you a snapshot of that. So there's been research into invertebrates, particularly dragonflies can really do really well from beaver activity, from having more water stored within the area, and also the vegetation around water bodies as well can be beneficial for the adults, and even sort of sites have found rare dragonfly species moving in when they weren't previously recorded as well. Research has been conducted on bats. In this case, this is some research from Poland looking at foraging bats, and they compared the 3 pipistrelle species and noctule species in areas where there had beaver activity and no beaver activity. And generally what they found was where there was beaver activity, there was a greater increase in bats, and that's mainly because the increase in invertebrates, and the bats were following suit because the food supply was there. Going back to Devon, at this 3-hectare site in Devon, they looked at amphibians. So before the beavers were released in 2011, they only counted 10 clumps of frog spawn within the site. By 2017, they recorded over 600 clumps of frog spawn, and that's just because the amount of water that was on site, the beavers would the frogs were just following suit and just taking advantage of all that water. And this has had knock-on benefits. And they've noticed that over time, grass snakes have started moving into the site, and otters too. And that's mainly because of the food supply there with the amphibians. Other wildlife are moving in. So again, just that knock-off benefits of having beavers, how other wildlife can benefit just because the increasing foraging opportunities, resting and nesting opportunities as well. And there's been lots of research on the impacts of fish. Beavers and fish can be quite a complex subject, and not everyone's happy with beavers coming back because they're worried about the impacts on fish. Some people are worried that beaver dams could block the passage for migratory fish. What the research has shown there, that overall the benefits of beavers, beaver activity can be really beneficial for all fish species, from game fish to coarse fish. However, in some situations, beaver dams can be a temporary blockage to migratory fish, particularly in low flow events. But overall, the benefits far outweigh the negative impacts. And in some areas where beaver dams have been a barrier to fish migration, these can either be modified or fish passages can be built in or created into the beaver dams to allow that to happen. But overall, it's found that because of beaver activity by beavers creating dams, this can create nurseries for different lots of fish species, areas for fish to hide in, as well as creating still water, as well as running water and different depths of water, which can be beneficial to a wide range of different fish species. But as I said, it is quite a complex subject, and although some research has been done, there's still opportunities for a lot more research to be undertaken. But overall, beaver habitats are generally very dynamic. They are complex and they're diverse as well. And so this picture here just shows sort of the changes that can happen with beaver activity, from having a very incised stream or river to over time, through the activity of beavers, having very complex dynamic wetland habitat, quite extensive wetland habitats. However, over the years, there have been lots of beaver introductions happening. And so through all this research, people recognise the benefits of beavers and want to start looking at bringing them back as a keystone species. So since the 1920s, beaver introductions have been taking place. So first reintroductions happened predominantly in Scandinavia, and it was more to reintroduce, restore a lost species, a game species. But now through sort of having a lot more knowledge about beavers, efforts to reintroduce beavers are more to do with conservation efforts than anything else. So on this graph, the black dots are those relic beaver populations across Europe and Eurasia, and the red shading is where beavers have been actively reintroduced or translocated and natural dispersal as well. On this map, you may notice some green shading with the label Castor canadensis. So that's a North American beaver, and that's from dating back to some of the early reintroductions. So when beavers were first reintroduced back into Europe, as you may remember from a few slides ago, there weren't many beaver sites left in Europe at the late 19th century, and at that point we only had 1,200 individual animals left. So because of that, the people went over to North America to bring beavers back to help with the reintroduction efforts in Europe. North American beavers and Eurasian beavers pretty much look identical. They didn't realise they were two separate species, so use those animals to help with the efforts over here. We now know that they are a different species, so they are trying to manage the North American beavers are in Europe to allow the natural restoration of the Eurasian beaver. And as you can see in Britain, there's some red dots on this part of the map, and so this is what we'll look at next. So starting off with Wales, with the Welsh Beaver Project, this started in 2005. Started off with scoping studies, and the Wildlife Trust in Wales agreed to sort of take a lead on beaver introductions in Wales. But before anything could happen, we undertook feasibility studies and also consultation with key stakeholders, and to examine what the long-term sort of future would be of reintroducing beavers back into Wales. So with the feasibility studies, this started off with GIS studies, on-the-ground survey, and followed by on-the-ground surveys to look at the amount of water available, what those sites were like, looking at the surrounding habitat predominantly for beavers in terms of making sure there's enough habitat suitable for them, but also the surrounding landscape and what the impacts might be for the surrounding landscape. Are we looking at low-lying areas, flat areas? Are we looking at steep-sided valleys, or a mixture of the two? And as I mentioned, we also undertook consultation with key stakeholders to see what people thought about beavers coming back. Most people were supportive, but as you can imagine, some concerns were raised, which is completely understandable. And we do recognise that in some areas, not all beaver impacts will be positive. There may be some negative impacts. And so this is just a summary of some of the issues that are raised. So we've taken those all on board, and that formed part of our feasibility study. However, with beavers, you can manage them. So if there are any sort of negative impacts, there are ways, lots of techniques to mitigate against the negative impacts. This book has been published outlining some of those techniques, and this is based on techniques that have been developed in Europe, mainland Europe, but also more recently looking at the work that's been happening in Scotland and England as well, and sort of demonstrating what you can do if some negative impacts arise. For example, if a dam is built in the wrong place and that's causing localised flooding, or localised flooding that you don't want to occur, for example, if it's going to flood a neighbouring field or a nearby road, or if unwanted beaver tree felling, if your garden backs onto a river and you don't want beavers to take out your prize trees or any specimen trees, what you can do in those situations. And all those techniques are outlined in here. So modifying beaver dams to ensure that they're not going to cause untenable localised flooding, protecting specimen trees to prevent beavers and then felling them and taking them for food. So we can learn from what our colleagues have been up to with neighbouring projects in neighbouring countries, and we can learn a lot about those to ensure that we can manage the impacts of beavers so we get all the positive and minimise the negative impacts. So in terms of the Welsh Beaver Project, in our feasibility studies, we identified 6 initial catchments to start with in terms of where the sort of very first beaver introduction to Wales could take place. Our feasibility studies were published in 2012, but since then we've done further studies, and we're now looking at the Dyfi catchment, which is just above Aberystwyth and the west coast of Wales. So we're looking at a wild release, reintroducing beavers into this catchment, but this site is also home to Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust's Dyfi Nature Reserve. So for the Welsh Beaver Project, our main aim is a reintroduction into the wild. We've applied for a licence with Natural Resources Wales, and we've still got a bit more information to provide to them. But in addition, as the Welsh Beaver Project, we've been advising other projects, and we've been working with Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust for their plans for an enclosed beaver project at their Dyfi Nature Reserve. So Dyfi Nature Reserve is a lowland peat bog. However, it's gone through a lot of mismanagement over the years, and at one stage it was a conifer plantation which has damaged the site, and this was prior to the Wildlife Trust owning the site. When the Wildlife Trust then took on Dyfi Nature Reserve, they clear felled the plantation to allow the bog to restore. However, over the years, willow's just taken over, and so now the lowland peat bog is just covered by willow scrub, which is also having an impact on the site. It is causing part of the bog to dry out. It's very difficult to manage. The scrub is so dense. It's very difficult to get in there to coppice the willow. It's also very dangerous to manage a site because of the legacy of the forestry, from old drainage ditches to old tree stumps. It's just very difficult to get in there with hand tools to try and manage the scrub. So for that reason, we've been looking at alternative options, techniques to manage this site. So this has included using water buffalo in the past, which were very successful at managing the site, although they only really went for the softer vegetation. They didn't really go for sort of the more established, harder willow. And so that still needs to be managed. So that sort of took us back to the drawing board to have a look at ways we could manage the site sort of more sustainably and sort of effectively as well. So that got us thinking about beavers. Willow is one of the favourite food species for beaver. It's also a wetland site as well, so beavers would be ideal in this site. So with that in mind, because we wanted beavers to stay on the reserve, to manage the reserve, we put plans together and built a purpose-built enclosure for beavers to be then released onto the site to help with manage this habitat, to help restore a lowland peat bog. The beavers, for this reason, are there on the site for a particular reason. So because it's an enclosed site, it's very different to reintroducing beavers into the wild. The beavers can only go so far because they're in an enclosure. So the management for an enclosed project is very different to beavers being in the wild. We then applied for a licence to release the beavers into enclosure. The licence came through in March of this year, and by the end of March, we saw the arrival of our beaver family. So the first part of the beaver family were released into our 7-acre enclosure by Yola Williams. So we have father and son just coming out of the crate. So father's the black one and the son's the brown beaver just behind. These beavers were sourced under licence from Scotland, from conflict sites in Scotland, health screened and then brought down to the enclosure. And the black beaver itself, there's not commonly found in Britain. It's more commonly found in Eastern Europe than Britain. However, beavers in Britain have come from various sites, come from Norway, have come from Bavaria. So these beavers are, although they come from Scotland, are of Bavarian origin. So this black beaver is of Bavarian origin, but with some Eastern genes in it, which is, yeah, we're really lucky and really excited to have beavers on the site, and yeah, even more special that we've got a black beaver as well. And so the site itself is 3 interconnected ponds with lots of willow. So the beavers have soon settled in and made themselves at home. So the idea is to manage this willow, and the beavers have got to work. And so this is an example of some of the beaver activity that we found. So lots of willow coppicing going on. We realised that the beavers will never get rid of all the willow. That's never going to happen on this site. However, just by having beavers coppicing the willow, there will be then regeneration of the willow over time. But just by doing the initial coppicing is going to help reduce the height of the willow, open up the canopy, allow more light to come through, and hopefully that will allow other vegetation to come through and establish on the site, more wetland bog vegetation to come back, so more bog myrtle, hopefully more sphagnum moss, and just to help just make this site a lot better than it is in its current state. The beavers also created a number of canals on this site, so that's helping to open up the wetland site as well, and just help keep it nice and wet and keep re-wetting it. This is a lowland site, so unlike other sites, it doesn't have and it's a ponded site as well. It doesn't have a defined stream flowing through it, so we're not going to get beaver damming on this site like that you may do in other sites like the enclosed site in Devon. However, by beavers just creating the canals, so which beavers will do in some areas, will help just keep the water bodies nice and connected. So it's a good example of what beavers might do in a slightly different landscape and allow us to compare it to other projects that have come before us. And it all just adds to our knowledge base. And so we are monitoring beavers, we're monitoring their activity, we're doing visual observations through camera traps in terms of monitoring the beavers. In terms of the habitats, we're doing fixed point photography. We're also doing dip well monitoring around the site to measure, keep an eye on the water levels and see whether beavers will help with raising the water levels or not on this particular site. It's still early days yet with our project. The beavers are only been in for about 7 months now, so still early days in terms of our data collection, but hopefully in a few years' time we'll be able to make some conclusions about the beaver activity on this site. And so as part of our plans, for sort of going back into our main sort of plans for introducing beavers back into the wild, we've undertaken national and local consultations, and these discussions will be ongoing. We'll be doing further discussions as we go through our project. And as part of our plans for introducing beavers back into the wild, we have created a local beaver management network. So as I mentioned, we do realise that some negative impacts might arise because of beavers being introduced into an area. And so in order to minimise that, we've created a local volunteer network. So if there is an issue arising from beavers being back, one of our volunteers can go out and assess what that issue might be, liaise with the landowner, land manager, and see what sort of mitigation techniques need to be undertaken. So we can learn a lot from what other projects have done. And so as I mentioned, by doing this, hopefully it minimises the potential conflicts and allow us to have the benefits of beavers, and just showing that we can live with beavers once again, and just sort of making sure beavers are in the right place to ensure that these benefits can occur. And hopefully the information from the core study enclosed project will help build into this, add to our knowledge base as well, and also help with our discussions with what beavers can do and how we hope beavers can. Well, the beavers from the enclosure will never release into the wild. They'll always be on the reserve to help with managing the reserve. But if we are allowed to bring other beavers in and reduce them into the catchments, sort of the benefits that the beavers could have and what the long-term effects may be. In terms of a project in due course, Natural Resources Wales will lead a national public consultation to see what people think about the idea of beavers actually coming back into the wild and being released into the wild. So it'll give an opportunity for everyone to have their say if they wish to do so. And in terms of Scotland and England, so in Scotland, beaver discussions have been going on decades in Britain. So in Scotland, the very first consultations happened in the 1990s, and the very first beaver introduction into Britain started in Scotland with the Scottish beaver trial, where a number of beaver families were brought from Norway and released into Knapdale Forest in Argyll. This became the Scottish Beaver Project. It also then eventually included the beaver population that was discovered on the east part of the country in the Tayside catchment shortly afterwards in 2010. So these two beaver populations, both on the west coast in Knapdale and those on the east in Tayside, became part of the Scottish Beaver Project and were monitored sort of side by side. When the Scottish Beaver trial finished, a final report was submitted to the Scottish Government. And then in 2016, the Scottish Government minded to allow beavers to stay. And eventually in 2019, beavers are granted legal protection in Scotland, and with that came sort of management and beaver mitigation as well. And in England, the very first beaver project started with an enclosed beaver project in Kent, and since then there's been many more enclosed projects. In 2008, there was a feasibility studies were undertaken to look at beavers being introduced into the wild. And then 2014, a bit like in Scotland, some free-living beavers were discovered on the River Otter in Devon. And so these became part of the River Otter Beaver Trial managed by Devon Wildlife Trust, and a licence was granted to Devon Wildlife Trust. And this was a 5-year trial which finished in August of last year. And with that came a science evidence report, and the UK government announced that beavers could stay on the River Otter and disperse naturally, although that was very much beavers on the River Otter. But as of August of this year, the UK government started a consultation on the future of beavers in England, looking at what the future might be and whether beavers may be allowed to be released or introduced to other parts of England under licence, and the sort of management that may need to be undertaken with that as well, and what management might be required so we can live alongside beavers. So this is a live consultation which is undergoing its sort of live right now and will finish on the 17th of November. So please feel free to head over to the DEFRA website if you do wish to respond to the consultation. The more responses they get, the better. And so in terms of the future of beavers in Britain, so beavers are the quintessential ecosystem engineer. Through their activities, they can have lots of knock-on benefits for wildlife. They create landscape changes which can help restore natural processes, which can be beneficial for lots of other wildlife, but also humans as well, in terms of flood risk management, improving water quality, particularly with the uncertainties we face with the future, with climate change, increasing in flooding risk, flash flooding, all these things could really help and be part of sort of looking at nature-based solutions to help with managing our local ecosystems and restoring natural processes. So obviously beavers on their own won't be a magic bullet. It's all part of looking at lots of different techniques to ensure to look at using more sustainable ways to manage our landscapes for the benefit of all. Mitigation, though, will be a vital part of any beaver introduction project. We need to recognise that negative impacts may arise and maybe some conflicts because of having beavers in certain areas. So having mitigation will help us to minimise or hopefully reduce or negate any of these negative impacts or conflicts, and again allow us to live alongside beavers so we have the positives and gain from the positives rather than having the negatives. And with that, national restoration and management policy is required, and hopefully the information gathered from this current beaver consultation will help with that and guide sort of government policy, and hopefully it will be overall positive. And that overall there is a place for beavers in Britain. And that brings me on to whether beavers will return to Shropshire. So I'll hand over to Matt shortly, where he'll be discussing whether beavers will be returning to Shropshire. So in terms of the Welsh Beaver Project, please do head over to our website to find out more information, and our feasibility studies are available on there for downloading if you wish to look in those in further detail to find out more information. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
I think I'm hoping Kat has got my presentation, which you can share.
I have it. I can share it.
Okay.
And then we'll do questions for both of you at the end.
Yeah. I'm in a rather remote part of South Wales at the moment, so I put the presentation with somebody else just because the connection might be a bit unstable. So I'll just let you know when to change the slides over.
Can you see the slides okay?
Yeah, got that. So yeah, I'm just going to talk a bit about the Shrewsbury Beaver Project, which I've been working on with Alicia, and kind of how we're progressing with that and what point it's at the moment. So we just go on to the first slide. So it's the Old Riverbed Triple SI where we're looking at doing this. It's a 17.5 hectare site, which is located in the north of Shrewsbury. It's completely, well, not completely, but almost completely surrounded by houses. It's a very urban residential area, which is why it's a bit of an unusual project. It's got recreation grounds and pretty much the town centre down at the south end, and large housing estates on the east and west side. There's a bit of agricultural land up to the north, but that's at the moment most of that's being used as a vineyard, and it's quite elevated compared to the site that we're actually looking at having beavers on. It's part of the old route of the River Severn, so it was cut off after the last ice age, probably about 6,000–7,000 years ago, which isn't really that long in geographical terms, so it still retains a lot of the characteristics of the river, and the River Severn now runs in a shorter route further south of this site. It's designated as a site of special scientific interest by Natural England, so it's given a fair degree of protection by the government, and we also receive funding as a result of that through high-level stewardship and other schemes like that. That amount has reduced quite a lot over the last sort of 10 years, which has caused problems for the site, which I'll come on to in a bit, but we do still receive funding for that. And obviously, as the landowners, we have a responsibility to some extent to make sure it's managed, but mainly to ensure that it's not being damaged through any kind of direct action by us or anybody else. It's got quite varied amount of wildlife. The habitat type is known as sedge fen, so it's dominated by things like lesser pond sedge, meadow sweet, and other rushes and flowering wetland plants. It's got an increasing amount of tree scrub on, so willow, alder, birch, which is encroaching from the edges. There's quite a variety of bird life. We've got sedge warblers, water rails, snipe, There's eels been recorded in some of the wetland ditches, and obviously a huge number of invertebrates as well. It's got the potential for a lot of other things, so there's no reason why it couldn't be a water vole habitat at some point in the future. That's obviously more to do with the things like predator control on the Severn, which is quite nearby. But there are various reintroductions going on with water vole around Shropshire at the moment, so it's somewhere that might have potential for that in the future. It provides a lot of services to the surrounding areas, so flood storage is a big one. It's a very wide, quite open site, and although it doesn't kind of visibly flood very often, it's even just a few centimetres of water across the entire site is actually a really big volume, and that's slowing it down and preventing it going straight down into the Severn. There's obviously a big value put on slowing the movement of water off surrounding land into rivers at the moment with modern flood strategies. So these types of big open wetland sites are really important, especially this close to an urban area. They've got the site has got a value with carbon capture. Peat bogs are the biggest carbon stores on the planet, and are probably more valuable even than rainforests in terms of sort of carbon storage. But it stands to reason then that damaging them or drying them out can release a lot of greenhouse gases and release a lot of carbon as well. So that's another reason why we want to prevent this site from drying out. And it's an important point that it's not always the answer to go planting trees everywhere. We've got areas like this that are going to be far more valuable to wildlife and far more valuable to climate change by not removing all the trees, but ensuring that they don't become completely tree covered and dried out. In terms of the hydrology of the site, there's a lot of organic matter. There's very slow decay going on, and as I say, the water percolates very slowly through the whole site, and it's not visibly flowing like a river across the site. So in terms of the management, going on from what I was saying before about trying to keep the site as wet as possible and stop it drying out, it's very similar to what we heard about the Cors Duffy Reserve, where we've been looking at removing excessive tree growth. So previously this has been manual removal with chainsaws, desilting the ditches with heavy plant. We have had grazing on the site, which in theory was a good idea, but generally putting cattle on a site like this, they'll stay up the dry north end of the site, they'll eat the soft vegetation, and they won't really go and get stuck into the scrub, particularly on the wetter areas where it's encroaching where we want them to go. So that probably had a bit of an impact, but it wasn't really doing very much. There's been a lot of funding reductions, as I said, from Natural England over the last few years. So that's actually resulted in the loss of the grazier that we did have. He was receiving a payment through us from Natural England for having the cattle on there, because it was quite a risky thing to do. If cattle were to get into trouble there or get injured, a lot of places you'd be looking at a helicopter to get them out. You can't get any vehicles on there. It's quite difficult to access for people on foot. So it was quite a risk for him to have his livestock on there. And once the funding was whittled down, it wasn't really worth the time and effort for him to put them on there. So that kind of left us a bit stuck really with all this funding disappearing. I've been a fan of beavers for a long time, and been really interested in seeing how they can transform sites and how they create all these other ecosystems like we've just heard about. And I didn't really believe that they could work on a site like this for many years, but the recent kind of surge in rewilding and thinking a bit differently about how we're managing these sites and trying to connect them up with the surrounding area, it was something that I started to consider again, and got in touch with Alicia, who initially came and looked at the site and said, yes, it's brilliant, it would suit them perfectly. So really that's kind of how we got things rolling. If I can have the next slide. So this is just a bit of a selection of the wildlife that we've currently got on the site. So as you can see, it's quite varied already. And I think this is a site that we're not looking to put beavers on and transform it into something completely different. We're looking at using them to protect what's there and try and make it be managed in a sustainable way. really, I think using them as a grazing animal, similar to Coors Duffy, where we're putting them in and using them as a bit of a management tool. And all of these species that are living there, they're probably well, they would have evolved definitely alongside European beaver. So there's kind of no obvious reasons why they should have any major problems with them. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see if there's other things that do come in as a result of the beavers being there. The site is listed in terms of its important features for the SSSI designation. It's more the habitat type that it's listed for rather than any specific endangered species, but it's just recognised that the entire ecosystem and the entire sort of collection of species that are found there is quite an interesting one. Next slide. So there's a few images here just to give you an idea of what the site's like to actually be on. The images down at the bottom are more up at the north end of the site, which is a little bit drier. We've got an existing sort of cattle pen, which is on the main entrance, and the image of the longhorn cattle there from previous years. Again, that's them standing up in the north end of the site. It's still soft ground, but it's not particularly wet. The image there of me wading through, that's about halfway down, so that's when it's starting to get quite deep and quite soft underfoot. And any further than that, really you're restricted to chest waders. And a lot of the site is just completely inaccessible, even with waders on, because the ground underneath the water is so soft. On the left-hand side at the top there, you can see some of the young willow growth, and this is really the stuff that we're looking at the beavers tackling. That's maybe not too much of a problem for the wetland as it is, but within a few years that will be getting a lot thicker. There'll be a lot of leaf litter falling down, root systems drying out the peat, and eventually the ground level sort of raises up out of the water and dries out. Okay, next slide. So in terms of the practical work required to actually do this project, it's a pretty big one. We're looking at around about 2 kilometre fenced enclosure, and you can see the outline of that on the left-hand side. Most of the boundary is actually already fenced with livestock fencing, although a lot of it's quite run down. But we're looking really along most of that line of replacing it with some type of beaver-proof fence. Now, there's a couple of designs for this. You can see the one up at the top on the right-hand side. That really just looks like a normal stock fence with electric wire along the top. With this being quite an urban, quite a public site, we probably wouldn't go for electric fencing. We'd go for something more like the bottom image, which has got the backward turned angle at the top to hopefully prevent them from climbing out. We'll have a number of gates around, which will be specially fabricated. And this will just allow pedestrian access onto the site if we need to do anything with the beavers. We need to do any maintenance to the fences, that sort of thing. We'll have to do a bit of ditch protection. We're quite lucky on this site in that we don't have defined sort of inlets and outlets and culverts and that sort of thing. So we're not going to have to put huge sort of grates and grills in like has been done on some of the other sites where there's beaver enclosures. But we will have to think a bit about where the beavers are most likely to be trying to escape, and obviously keep an eye on them causing any blockages. It's not a site that we anticipate them damming, because it's very wide and open, and there isn't a defined sort of valley running down the middle with water flowing down it. So they're very unlikely to actually make dams. What's much more likely to happen is they'll use the sort of existing depressions in the site and make little canal systems out from those to get to where the bulk of the food is available. So that'll be interesting to see how that changes over time. We're also looking at putting a boardwalk across the southern end of the site, which will enable the route to be walked in a complete circle, which will hopefully help with the fence checking and any issues that we have. There did actually used to be a boardwalk going across there many years ago, so we'll be looking to sort of reinstate it along that line. We might have to do some bits of tree protection. We don't have very many really mature trees on the site, but there is a few on the eastern bank, which you can see is the sort of the tree covered area up at the top of the plan. and some of the larger trees might fall within the enclosure. So if there are some that we are keen to protect, we can put either mesh around those, or there's types of sort of sandy paint that you can put on to deter the beavers from chewing them. Next slide. So in terms of the background work, there's an awful lot. I mean, this has probably been harder than the actual practical works for getting the beavers in. There's extensive specifications that have to be drawn up for this, and we've been kind of bouncing the designs of all this stuff between ourselves and Natural England to make sure everybody's happy with it and that it's realistic and achievable. Oh, I think I've lost the slide. Yeah, there's a huge amount of licensing needed to actually get this done through Natural England. It has been said before that it would be easier to have an enclosure with something like elephants in terms of the amount of paperwork that you need to do, which is amazing really, because beavers are effectively a native species. But obviously they've been absent from the landscape for a long time, and there has been a lot of anxiety from certain people about what kind of effect they can have on the land. And of course, as Alicia said, they are ecosystem engineers. They do have the potential to change things quite drastically. So I think Natural England are certainly sort of cautious and want to make sure that things are done the right way. So in terms of the number of licenses, we've got the AO3 license, which is a species release license, which has mainly been dealt with by Alicia. We've got felling licenses that are needed for the little bit of vegetation clearance that we need to do for the fence. We've got separate SSI consents for the felling work for the beavers themselves and for the work that needs to go on there. And for the also drone flights, we're working with CREST to have some drone surveys done. And again, because that's over a SSI, we need specific permission to do those. We've got felling licenses, and also we may need permits for the watercourse itself. Although it isn't really a flowing river, the Environment Agency define it as a main river. So there's probably sort of hoops that we'll need to jump through for that, although hopefully those will be quite simple. We've got various biological surveys which are going on. We've done some initial ones working with Harper Adams University and Rees Heath, and we've got a bit more of a plan of transect lines across the site now which have been installed. So hopefully those will be repeatable surveys that can be done on things like flora and invertebrates and water levels, water quality, things like that. And we'll be able to continue that through the project. And we've set those up with the universities just to make sure that they're sort of scientifically robust, so that the data that we're collecting, if somebody chooses to do a PhD or a paper on this in the future, then hopefully it should hold up to scrutiny. There's going to need to be a number of ecological checks going on the site. We do have a few protected species, so we will be calling in ecological consultants to just make sure that they're not being disturbed by any of the works. I mentioned, the drone surveys. We're hopefully got those starting quite soon, so they'll be looking at things like canopy cover, changes in the watercourses, and just the general sort of behaviour of the beavers. It's a really good way of seeing where they're going, which areas of the site they're using, and how they're impacting the site from having a snapshot from above, because we're not really going to see very much from the outside of the site. And it's such a difficult site to move around as well, that apart from going in and taking that quadrat data, we're not going to have a really good snapshot of what they're doing. But the drones should hopefully really cover that. We'll have some fixed point photography going on as well, just so there's some more examples of how the site's changing over time. We've got some public consultation which is going on at the moment with the immediate area surrounding the site. It's really important to just let people know what's going on and allaying any concerns. Hopefully it will be the usual thing about the beavers causing floods or eating all the fish or whatever it is. Hopefully we can do some education and just make sure everybody's on board with it. The Wildlife Trust are covering the sort of wider county consultation. They've got a big leaflet drop at the moment and a drive for recruiting members based on this project. So I know that they've got a survey open at the moment to see what people think. Now the monitoring all of this stuff really will be ongoing through the project. So yeah, we'll sort of be keeping an eye on how the site changes and again, public perception and any issues that people have nearby as the project's going on. We'll also be doing a lot of community and education outreach. Really, once we're at the point of the work starting on site, we'll be doing stuff with the local schools and local interest groups, just to get everybody on board and create as much interest in it as we can. We also need an exit strategy, which has been put in as part of the license. So it's technically it's a 5-year project, but we need to think about what happens at the end of that. Now, it could be that the beavers have bred and they're used as a source for other projects like this going on around the country. It might be that there's wild release licenses everywhere by then. So again, the beavers are being removed from here and taken and put somewhere else. So yeah, that is something we need to bear in mind. Do we extend the project at the end of that 5 years, or will it be kind of closed down and the beavers moved on somewhere else? Next slide. So the funding, we're in a position where we've pretty much secured all of what we need for this project now. The main funders are Severn Trent, Veolia, Potters Group, which are again linked to waste and landfill, and the People's Postcode Lottery. And there's various match funding from other project partners like the Wildlife Trust and Shrewsbury Town Council. So yeah, there is a crowdfunding, I think, is going to be launched quite soon. They're just waiting to tie off the recruitment drive and the survey, I think, at the moment, and then the Wildlife Trust are going to have a sort of big publicity drive. You can see the one down at the bottom for the Hatchmere project, which was quite similar in terms of how it came together to this one in Shrewsbury. And they had a big crowdfunding drive and did really well with it. So I think we'll probably be using the crowdfunding to do things like buy trail cameras and monitoring equipment, beaver trapping kits, possibly even to fund the purchase of the beavers themselves. So yeah, if anybody's interested, just keep your eye out for that if you want to donate. And if anybody's interested in being involved in the project in the future, then by all means drop myself or Alicia a line. We are going to need probably volunteer fence checkers once everything's up and running, to just walk around the perimeter of the fence, you know, maybe once a week, and yeah, just sort of keep an eye on things and report back to us. So I think that's it. I'll go over to take some questions now.
That's great. Thank you very much, Matt. I know we're as CREST, we're really looking forward to supporting with the Beaver project in Shrewsbury and using the drones to monitor the cover. I think it'll be quite exciting. So I've got a few questions. I think the first few are kind of, I think I put Alicia because they were put up when she was talking, so I'll start with those ones. And Rachel has asked, is there a risk of hybridization between the North American and European beavers, and how are North American beavers being managed?
Okay, so yeah, in terms of risk, there is no risk. So they're different sort of genetically. They have different numbers of chromosomes. So it means that, they're just not compatible. If they even did try and attempt to interbreed, that they wouldn't have viable young. And even where they do meet in wild situations, such as in parts of Eurasia, there's been no attempts of sort of breeding between the two species. So we don't have to worry from that part of it. However, the worry in terms of North American beavers being in Europe, well, for one thing, they're a non-native species, and the other, there is a risk that they might, in terms of their behaviour, might outcompete the Eurasian beaver. However, it depends on the landscape, because in some areas it's been found that the North American beaver will outcompete the Eurasian beaver. In other areas, it's the other way around. So we're not quite sure what's the driver, because their behaviour is, although two separate species, is very similar. But there is something that, depending on where they are, will trigger which one outcompetes the other. So which makes it quite interesting. Shows we don't know everything. And in terms of managing them, there's been various techniques, but I think mainly it's been sort of going in there, trapping and removing them. And unfortunately, with the North American beaver in Europe, it is a case of lethal control. In some areas, I think in Central Europe, where some North American beavers escaped from zoos, I think in that situation, I think there was trap and removal, but they also sort of sterilised North American beavers out in the wild, so the beavers could still stay, but obviously then couldn't breed with their own species and that. And then eventually the North American beaver in Central Europe has disappeared, but we still have them in Finland and parts of Russia at the moment.
Thank you. And then Andy has said that they've got a beaver release site in Cheshire, which is at the moment it's fenced in. Are there any plans to let them roam more freely in the future in parts of the UK?
So that's what's being discussed at the moment. So as a wildlife trust, I know a lot of us within the wildlife trust and other people would love that to happen, but it all depends on the outcome of this consultation. So once that ends, DEFRA, the UK government will have a discussion, but the hope is that reintroductions will be allowed, it will be under licence, and obviously there'll be certain criteria you have to meet, but we're being positive and we hope that's the case, because it'd be great to see them back across England, or across Britain really, with the right management systems in place. So yeah, watch your space and fingers crossed really.
Okay. Yeah, that's, I didn't realise that's actually Pascal has put the link into the chat, the link to the DEFRA consultation. So if people want to put their opinion forward, they can go through there. And then this is for either of you. Jane's asked about whether agricultural runoff impacts health of beavers.
Do you want me to answer that, Matt, or?
You take
Okay.
that one. I think I'll take the next
So
one.
it's a case of yes and no. So with the Devon project, with what they've been doing with monitoring of water quality, sort of low level runoff, not too much of an issue. And so far it has been it's been okay. But if you had sort of a major pollution event, it could well impact beavers' health. So like some of the pollution events, unfortunately, they have seen in various river systems and catchments. Yeah, if there was an accident and mass pollution, that could have a detrimental impact as it would on other wildlife, but low levels, so far so good. But it's one of those things you do have to keep an eye on to make sure, because obviously the beaver's health and welfare will come to everything else, especially if you're looking at an enclosed site. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, definitely. Yep, thank you. This next one, I don't know if this is the same answer that you alluded to with the North American beavers, but Jane's asked, in the enclosed sites, how do you manage size of population? Is it sterilisation?
Yeah, well, it's going to be. I mean, it's a big site that we're looking at in Shrewsbury. So initially, I think the intention is to have a pair, and as Alicia said, they're very slow breeders, and it might be that the site's actually big enough eventually to support two families or two breeding pairs. So when the time comes, it might be that there's like an exchange of beavers, so some taken from here and swapped with another one from somewhere else, because we'll need to think about the gene pool and making sure that we're not getting inbreeding, and obviously that'll have to be monitored, whether there's conflicts between them, and making sure that they've got enough space. But it is quite an extensive site, so it's probably going to be sort of towards or past the end of the current project plan, when we're going to be needing to move them out. But yeah, it's all just a case of keeping an eye on what's going on. They might not breed at all. They might breed a bit faster than we expect. So it's all just a case of monitoring that, really.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So sort of nothing to worry about immediately.
Yeah.
Then Roger asked about why Natural England approval is needed if the site's enclosed in Shrewsbury. Well,
I'll answer this a bit, and then I'll pass over to Alicia probably for the more technical answer. But it's a good question, because they're, as I say, we had longhorn cattle on there before. Now they're a farm animal. They're not a native species, but you wouldn't want those roaming around a housing estate. They've got the potential to be quite dangerous, but people are very familiar with them. But it's to me, there's no reason why you'd need a really complicated license to put what's essentially a native species in an enclosure and use it as a grazing animal, whereas for other things like cattle and even some rather unusual animals, you don't need that kind of license. And I think it's really just Natural England have needed a strategy for how beavers were being dealt with, and they just needed to make sure that they covered everything and didn't leave themselves and the project manager's open to criticism if things didn't go to plan. Yeah, so I don't know what your take on that is, Alicia.
So yeah, as you said, really, and the reason is why we need licenses because they changed the law in England. They changed the legislation. So up until 2018, you didn't need a license for releasing beavers into an enclosure. So the enclosed project in Devon and the when Cornwall Wildlife Trust worked on the beaver project with a local farmer, they didn't need a license either because, as Matt said, you're releasing beavers into an enclosure. Therefore, they're not a wild animal. They're almost like any other grazing animal. But yeah, the legislation changed for that. And yeah, as Matt was saying, I think it was in terms of Natural England's management strategy and to making sure that, I guess they wanted to make sure everyone was doing it properly. And I think it also comes down to sort of misunderstanding what some of these projects are, because sometimes they're referred to as reintroduction projects when as they're enclosed, they're not a reintroduction because the beavers are behind a fence, they're in captivity essentially. But I think there's sort of with saying reintroduction, there comes sort of other connotations, and yeah, I think it's just a case of keeping on top of everything. And yeah, so that's why we need to now.
Okay, thank you. That's fair enough. Thank you very much. I think that is all the questions. There's just a couple of comments that Andy's just reiterated that crowdfunding worked really well for Hatchmere and it got local people interested. So it was great to see sort of how the money's been spent and visit the area. And then Stuart has just made a point that the next funding appeal for the Beaver Project will start up in February 2022. And I think that is all the questions. So thank you very much to all four of our speakers. They were great talks, really interesting. It has been recorded, so we will, once we've edited it a bit, upload it to our YouTube channel and share. If anyone has any more questions or wants to get in touch with any of the speakers, Pascal has put her email in the chat, so feel free to contact Pascal, or you can go to the CREST website, which is crest@ucs.com, and it's got all our contact details in there. But that's it. So thank you all for coming.